Thank you very much. I decided to have this press briefing after listening to President Granger last night. I had intended to wait until after the CCJ process was completed. And the reason I did so is, as many people may wish, that I'll come here and try to disparage and take apart everything that he said, because so much that Mr. Granger spoke about last night was factually wrong, and in any case, downright misleading. And in many cases, downright misleading. So throughout it all, Mr. Granger never for a moment acknowledged what the country knows, that Mingo was the primary source of the fraud that led to the delay in the declaration of the results, and that has been proven. We have a certificate signed by Mr. Mingo, a declaration that is at odds with the Region 4 document, the declaration that was certified after the recount. And in that, those two documents, it has been demonstrated factually, mathematically, etc., that Mingo inflated the figures in favor of APNU by over 19,000 votes and reduced another 3,000 votes for the People's Progressive Party. And he never acknowledged for a single moment that Mr. Lowenfield was prepared to make a declaration. In fact, he prepared a report to the commission on the basis of Mingo's fraudulent report, which has been now proven to all of Guyana and the entire international community, and there is documentary evidence to that fraud. He never for a single moment stopped to consider the 115,000 people who will lose the 25% of the electorate, who will lose their right or their vote simply because Lowenfield will not follow the instructions of the commission and believes that he has some God-given authority, because it definitely doesn't come from the Constitution or the laws of Guyana, to unilaterally invalidate 115,000 valid votes on the basis of allegations by APNU. And I'm tempted to ask Mr. Granger, if it was the other way around, would APNU have accepted that one person, not the court, who has no authority? Mia Motley made it quite clear that he has no authority to invalidate one vote, much less 115,000 votes. But whether they would have accepted that, that he could unilaterally, outside of a court petition, invalidate 101 or take away the vote from 1/4 of the people, a full quarter of the people who voted on election day on the basis of allegation. They would have never accepted that. In fact, you would have had trouble in the streets already. They didn't need to do that because in 2015, because the PPP with just a 4,000 votes difference walked away. That's decency, Mr. Granger. So not for a moment did he acknowledge this. Not for a moment did he acknowledge that the entire international community has been saying that the recount figure forms the basis for the declaration of the results. So I think the purpose of him coming out last night on a friendly TV station was to give support to Harman's vile rhetoric, but in a more polished form, against the international community, and to lend support to the embattled Lowenfield, who has committed an act of fraud. And I think that was the purpose of him coming out. And why does Mr. Granger, if he has nothing to fear, avoid giving interviews with the independent media, which will ask him the tough questions? He could only do what he did last night, where questions are prepared beforehand, and then he comes to the interview to roll out the line that APNU has been peddling through their minions and through many others. So I'm tempted today to take that tone. I'm tempted to take that tone of totally disparaging what he said and criticizing it as somebody who is delusional, out of touch, and being fed propaganda by his staff that he readily imbibes because he wants the same outcome. He wants to hang on to power illegally, knowing that he has lost the elections. And I'm tempted to point out that there's nothing decent about that. Look at Suriname, a president who was embattled to have a lot of charges facing him, but readily conceded to the will of the people in the elections result. And so, but I decided that maybe we can point out if his only source of information is Harman and the crew that goes there to meet with him, which would feed him bits of information, because it does not seem as though he is reading the newspapers or processing what the entire world is saying. So I want to take a different approach today. I just want to go through what he said and point out to the factual errors. Now, there are things that Mr. Granger said here that on the face of it looks good. But he has said many of those things before and never respected what he said. For example, abiding by court decisions, etc., or abiding by the Constitution. And then he goes and he does exactly the opposite to his public declarations. So I'm going to start towards the end of his interview and just read a couple of things that he's spoken about, or he said. So he said, "We have publicly stated that we support the Elections Commission, both the chairman and the chief elections officer, and we are prepared to live by the outcome. Once the chair makes a declaration, which I hope is soon, we will abide by that declaration." A perfectly normal, credible, and laudable statement. He's then asked by Benchcop, that declaration is based on credible votes, valid votes. And then he goes on to say, the commission is bound to accept the report of the chief elections officer. He is the authority. There is no other authority to prepare such a report. He is mandated to prepare a report. The report will include the tabulation and the validation in the form of observation. And if the observation shows that there has been corruption, he is obliged to make such a report. The process has to go to the commission for review, and we expect a declaration which is going to be acceptable to all of Guyana and the international community. That is where we are. The process is in the hands of the commission. I cannot intervene at this stage. I have not intervened before, and I will not intervene now. So there are things that I agree with in this statement. First of all, the process is in the hand of the commission. It is the commission that makes the decision. Not any court, not the CCJ, nor the Court of Appeal in Guyana. They will not make the decision for the commission. The commission is the only constitutional body that can make the decision and the declaration of the results. Now, he speaks about the authority of this CEO as the only authority. But before I speak about that, there seems to be a confusion, a serious confusion in the mind of Mr. Granger. He speaks about the report, and this is what he had to say about the report on page 1 of his interview, the first part of his interview. He said, the second stage that we're in now, remember Granger touts this 4 stages process. The second stage that we're in now is that the chief elections officer is required to produce a report. And in fact, that report has already been produced. So we have already moved to the 3rd stage. You recall his 4 stages process. That report has to be presented to the commission, and the commission has to review the report, Now, there seems to be a major confusion in his mind as to the report that should be produced by the order, in accordance with the order, which says that the chief elections officer must produce a report tabulating the valid votes cast, that is the 10 certificates for the 10 regions in the recount, and submit this along with summaries for the 10 regions of the observation reports. And then the commission, the 3rd stage is that the commission will discuss this and decide the approach, what to instruct the chief elections officer what data to use. That is in contrast to the final report, the report that he has to produce after that instruction is given to him. So the chief elections officer did produce that report, and in his report to the commission, he showed that the People's Progressive Party won the elections, and in his report he has total valid votes cast, 460,000, the PPP 233,000, APNU 217,000. He did. The commission discussed this, Mr. Granger. Not that it has to be reviewed the report. They did review the report. They did. And Justice Singh at that stage, APNU was asking for an invalidation or an annulment of the elections. She made it clear that she had no authority to annul the elections. She could not invalidate any vote because that has to be done only through an elections petition to the High Court. And thirdly, she wrote Lowenfield instructing him to prepare the final report, that is the calculation of the seats that the party won, using the recount data. A decision has already been made by the commission to use the recount data. That is a decision made already. So he is a bit confused about the two reports. The report he is saying that has to be reviewed by the commission, that Lowenfield was supposed to submit to the commission pursuant to the recount order. That report was submitted, and Mr. Granger, it has been reviewed. And after the commission, the independent constitutional body, reviewed it, consistent with the order, they gave directions to Lowenfield, who is a statutory officer. He's a statutory officer, and he has refused to comply with that instruction. So there's a big confusion about what the commission is bound to do. Now, on that point where he said that the commission is bound to accept Lowenfield's report, I don't know which report he's talking about, because Lowenfield already has instructions from the commission to use the recount data. So Lowenfield, a few days ago, trying to justify his fraudulent submission, issued a release, and he said that he is a constitutional officer, and therefore he cannot take instructions from anyone. Well, Mr. Granger should know that Lowenfield is not a constitutional officer, and we pointed this out. He was never appointed through a constitutional process like we had with the appointment of the members of the commission and the chair of GCOM. Their appointment is enshrined in the Constitution. We know now that Mr. Lowenfield is a statutory officer. He is hired by the commission, the constitutional body. So what he is effectively saying, that the constitutional body must lose all of its authority and powers, which it exercised when it instructed Lowenfield to prepare the report using the recount data, and they must subject themselves to a fraudulent report that he has done now, dropping 115,000 names or causing 115,000 people to lose their vote in his report, that they must now rubber stamp his report and declare the results on the basis of that report. That is taking away the powers from the constitutional body. The constitutional body has already made the decision, Mr. Granger, to use the recount data. Lowenfield is subjected to directions from this body. He doesn't stand above them. They can't rubber stamp. If they had no authority, and I'll disprove that in a moment, then he's saying that their role there is just to rubber stamp anything that the commission, the CEO comes up with. And his own Vincent Alexander pointed out in 2011 how he, as a member of the commission, had to intervene in a report produced by the chief elections officer because there was errors in the report. and that he and the commission had to correct the errors to make the proper declaration. He should go back and look at history. Nevertheless, Mr. Granger, just for if you have not read our release and you keep holding on to this thing that Lowenfield has the authority to direct the commission now what to do. Well, these are, we pointed out, the sections of the law that show that Lowenfield has no such authority. And the first one is Section 18 of the Elections Law Amendment Act 2000, where it says that the Chief Election Officer and the Commissioner of Registration shall, notwithstanding anything in any written law, be subject to the direction and control of the Commission. Now, the Commission has given direction already to use the recount data. He has to comply. Additionally, in the same order, the recount order, it says that for the avoidance of any doubt, point 15, the Chief Elections Officer and every person appointed or authorized to perform any act or functions by virtue of this order are and shall remain subject to the general supervisory power of the Commission. And what is even more powerful is the constitutional role of the Commission, where it says, Article 162(1)(b) says that the Elections Commission shall issue such instructions and take such action as appear to it necessary or expedient to ensure impartiality, fairness, and compliance with the provisions of this Constitution or of any act of Parliament on the part of persons exercising powers or performing duties connected with or relating to the matters aforesaid. That is the administrative conduct of elections. So Lowenfield was hired by the Commission, and the Constitution of Guyana says that they can intervene, they can take any act necessary or expedient to ensure impartiality, fairness, and compliance. Now, what Lowenfield did is not impartial, it's partial. It took a victory for the PPP Civic and gave it to APNU. It is not fair, and the Commission has the authority to correct it. And so when Mr. Granger believes that the Commission is bound but to accept the report of Lowenfield, he is simply wrong. And I hope that he is advised in that regard. Mr. Granger then goes on, and let me deal with this, the CARICOM issue. Mr. Granger then goes on conveniently to ask people to read the entire CARICOM report. And I wonder if he read the report, because the report that he continues to say that he agrees with made it very, very clear in its findings and conclusions that the recount data forms a credible basis for the declaration of the results. And every international organization supports this. So he read one section of the CARICOM report where they spoke about in the future, what needs to be done in the future in terms of reforms. And he ignores the following things. That, first of all, I'm going to quote again the sections of the report that Granger avoided. One section which says, "We are of the unshakable belief that the people of Guyana express their will at the ballot box and the results are completely acceptable." That's the results of the recount. 2, despite our concerns, nothing that we witness warrants a challenge to the inescapable conclusion that the recount results are acceptable and should constitute the basis of the declaration of the results of the March 2nd, 2020 election. Mr. Granger, did you not read this? Any aggrieved political party can be afforded the right to seek redress before the courts in the form of an elections petition. It goes on to say, the national recount process then, despite some of its minor flaws, is not an indictment of the 2020 polls, and the team categorically rejects the concerted public efforts to discredit the 2020 polls up to the disastrous Region 4 tabulation. Who do you think they're speaking of? About who are the people trying to discredit the polls? It's Granger and Harman and the others. And the nightly show that we have, Adventure on TV, talking about dead voters, etc. In fact, it goes on to say, the CARICOM report, the numerous requests for information on serial numbers were so bizarre that on one observed occasion, an APNU AFC agent was prepared to query serial numbers on the OLE in a workstation where no one had voted. That is how bizarre it got, Mr. Granger. These challenges were often made on the ground of death and migration. Presumably, therefore, the contention is that in the March 2nd, 2020 polls, the phenomenon of ghost voting occurred, as well as voter impersonation and other forms of voter fraud. The team viewed much of the exercise as a fishing expedition, Mr. Granger, designed to gather data for a possible election petition, and which resulted in considerable time being wasted during the recount. Furthermore, the net was cast extremely wide in the hope of at least making a small catch, and at times the anticipated harvest ended in slim pickings. So, Mr. Granger, this is the CARICOM report. That's the conclusion. And it goes on, the public utterances of some GCOM commissioners, political pundits, and politicians may have sounded an ominous tone for the 2020 elections, with the partisan-driven and distorted narrative on migrant voting, phantom voting, and implied voter impersonation. The recounting of the votes was conducted with as much precision as possible and with absolutely no hint of bias shown on the part of the GCOM station workers. This is the CARICOM report, that the same one that you mentioned last night. Those were its conclusion. The same report that you defended, and the same process that you defended when we asked the leaders of CARICOM to come here or to send a team to help to supervise the recount. We both agreed to this. This is their finding. You promised to abide by their finding. I've just read to you what their conclusions were, that the recount data must be used. You ignored all of this and then went to some sections where they were talking about future reform. They're saying none of the allegations that you made or your people made about dead voters and migrant voters, they were valid and they were just a fishing expedition. That's the CARICOM report. And so one of the key points in his interview was that we should all read the CARICOM report. Then we read it. Have you read it? And if you have read it, why have you not conceded by now? Why have you not conceded? The CARICOM report makes it clear that the data you need that should determine the outcome of the elections should be the recount data. And that is why CARICOM heads who have stuck with the report and the international community find that CARICOM team was more credible than the APNU, than the Sherrod Duncan, or the Joe Harmon of this world. In fact, how could he finds only Lowenfield credible, Harmon's comments credible, but the CARICOM team, Mia Motley, Ralph Gonzalez, Bruce Golding, all the leaders, the Secretary General of the Commonwealth, the OAS, none of these people are credible, but only the most credible people are Mingo, Lowenfield, Harmon, and Sherrod Duncan. That is the decency we're talking about. So I would urge Mr. Granger, if he has not read the report, if Joe Harmon just sent him those little bits, those little snippets as to what he should read on TV last night, because it seems that's where it's coming from, then he should read that too. So, Mr. Granger, you're wrong on the authority of the CEO. You're confusing the report, the final report that he has to produce with the report pursuant to the order in Stage 3. And you're confusing the fact that the commission has already decided what to use, the recount data. And the recount data shows a victory for the People's Progressive Party. The CARICOM report that you cited is selectively cited, and you ignored the biggest part of it. Now, let's come to what he had to say about the court. So, first of all, the question was asked about whether by the bench cop, about the PPP challenging the validity of their votes. And we're not challenging the validity of the votes. We argue that the Court of Appeal ruling that votes in our Constitution mean valid votes is a non-issue, because it couldn't mean invalid votes. The votes have to be valid in any case. And the Representation of the People Act point out to what a valid vote is. It's not for Lowenfield to decide what a valid vote is. It is, so that's the next issue. But we don't have any issue with any court saying that valid votes, more votes cast mean more valid votes, because we agree with that in principle. It couldn't mean otherwise. What we have gone to the court on is because they've exceeded that jurisdiction and interfered with the process, how a president could be challenged and how the results of the elections could be challenged, and took jurisdiction in areas where they had none. And this has far-reaching implications for Guyana. So I agree with you, Mr. Granger, that one way or another, since neither the CCJ nor the Court of Appeal in Guyana can tell the Commission how to decide or what to decide on a declaration, that the matter will go back to the Commission. And we are arguing that the Commission already made that decision when Lowenfield was instructed to use the recount data. We did not, we wrote the chair, notice we wrote the chair of GCOM to say that she should ask Lowenfield to withdraw, because the report, it's not just an act of insubordination, it's an act of fraud. He is refusing lawful instructions from the Guyana Elections Commission. He was directed to prepare a report using recount data. So they want to own this word valid, but they don't own the word valid. So the word valid is mentioned, only valid votes were counted when the statements of recount were done. Because the votes that were invalidated were ballot papers that were invalidated were ballot papers without any stamp or ballot papers that did not meet other requirements as outlined by the law. So the moment the statements of recount were completed, though that's where only valid votes were counted here. Then the valid votes were from each statement of recount were tabulated in the presence of all the political parties, and Lowenfield staff, the secretariat staff, certified on 10 regions with total valid votes for the 10 regions. On 2 places in that form, in the certificate, it mentions the word total valid votes cast. So that's on 10 certificates. We have 10 certificates for the regional elections and 10 certificates for the national elections, which are certified by GCOM staff, which says the valid votes cast. The CEO then tabulated those and submitted a report about total valid votes cast in his initial submission, which you're confusing with the final submission. And so that is the issue. He has departed now from tabulating valid votes to going on an adventure where he could invalidate 115,000 persons votes without hearing them. And he has no authority to do that. Without hearing them, without getting any documentary evidence, he just in a day, in fact 2 days, he just unilaterally does this. And moving, first he had removed the vote from 275,000. Then he dropped that to 115,000. Is this not madness? How could you, as a head of state, support this sort of arbitrary behavior and unlawfulness? So he has acted unlawfully, and now he has claimed in his latest fraudulent submission, after refusing the instruction of the chair of GCOM to prepare a report on the basis of the recount data or the total valid votes as he had submitted, and that are on 10 certificates for each region signed to as total valid votes. To justify that, he then submitted, he cites guidance from the Court of Appeal. So what is interesting, Mr. Granger did not deal with at all. He creates the impression that it's the court that gave Lowenfield the cover to submit this. But the court has no authority to tell Lowenfield about or direct the commission what outcome or what the declaration should be. The commission is a constitutional body. It is a parallel to the court. It's a creature of the Constitution. And they have already made the decision what they want to use, the data they use. The court can't direct them to use any other data. So that would be exceeding its authority. No court. And therefore, the commission, as Mr. Granger himself pointed out, is the one that makes the final decision. And with all due respect, they made the decision as to what data should be used. After deliberating it and after what the chair of GCOM spoke about, that only through an elections petition that votes could be invalidated. So in their own submission, and this is what he ignored totally, I don't know if Harman told him this, that although Lowenfield claimed in his covering letter that he got guidance from the Court of Appeal ruling, so in their submission, in APNU's submission to the CCJ, it says, and I'll quote you exactly, you've read it before, the difficulty with the appellant's argument, that's our argument, is that its very substratum is inherently inaccurate. The Court of Appeal did not purport by its order to determine the validity of an election, nor of votes cast in respect of any election. Rather, the Court of Appeal determined solely a question as to the validity of an election of a president. Remember, the president has not been elected as yet. Insofar as that question concerned the interpretation of the Constitution and no more. In other words, the Court of Appeal made no determination as to whether the votes cast were valid or not, and imposed no criteria for which the validity of the votes would be determined. Simply put, the effect of the Court of Appeal's decision is that the election of a president will be determined on the basis of valid votes in accordance with the law. That we don't have an objection with this, in as much as we have an objection with the decision of the court on other issues, on the jurisdictional issues. So what is it? They're saying the lawyers for Harman and APNU went to the CCJ now and told the CCJ that why is the PPP appealing this issue? Because the court never determined what a valid vote is, and the court never established the criteria by which the validity of votes would be determined. So how then would Lowenfield determine that he unilaterally, citing the Court of Appeal decision, can invalidate 115,000 valid votes? What criteria did he use if the Court of Appeal did not, or the APNU is saying the Court of Appeal never made that decision? So this is the huge confusion. Now Granger avoided this totally. So they're telling you one thing here, but in their filings before the CCJ, so he supports Lowenfield, and Lowenfield says, I'm guided by the Court of Appeal decision. And they're saying now the Court of Appeal made no such decision to establish criteria for valid vote. Because the results of the elections have to be on the basis of valid votes. But the valid votes are not determined now. They're determined at the count, when people see that if a valid vote is not counted, an invalid vote is not counted. If it doesn't have a stamp, it's not counted. That's an invalid vote. So, and on all the certificates, it has valid votes. And Lowenfield has to, the law says he has to prepare his report in accordance with the counted vote. And secondly, he has been given directions to use the recount data. All he had to do was to go back and calculate the number of seats, which he's refused to do. He went back and he then dropped 115,000 votes unilaterally and gave APNU a victory. which is a fraudulent act. And he'll have to face consequences for that. So these are a few issues I wanted to deal with. I'm dealing with it this way because I'm hoping that Mr. Granger will understand that his arguments are all flawed, and that they're fed to him by people, the Harmon and the other gang, who will make him look, embarrass him totally, who will embarrass him totally if he persists with this. People say he's part of this plot to mislead people and stuff like that. He could very well be part of that plot, that this is all deliberate on his part to continue misleading Guyana. But at least I have an obligation to show how flawed and his arguments are. He rightly says that the commission must make the decision, that they're the only authority to make that decision. With all due respect, they made the decision when they decided to instruct Lowenfield to prepare the report on the basis of the recount data. He wrongly says that they're bound to accept the CEO report because elevating the CEO to above the constitutional body, and he is a statutory officer hired by the body. He ignores the constitutional provisions where the commission can act to ensure impartiality and fairness, and in this case, toward fraud. And they have used that provision already by signing the recount order to ensure that was the order under which the recount was done. So, and then he selectively uses the CARICOM report. Now, these were the three main issues that I saw. But on other issues, I agree with him that it's the commission. He says he has not sought to interfere with the commission and its work. We believe these rehearsed appearances are to do exactly that, to bring pressure on the commission, that these public statements by many of his officials are designed to do that. The commission has made a decision, and that was in the letter of the commission, the chair of the commission, to the CEO when she directed that Lowenfield prepare the report in accordance with the recount data. I'm not going to go through the many other issues. Mr. Granger continues to talk about people being killed and all of that. I don't think, I think they're trying to infuse a new narrative into all of this propaganda now that's going on, designed to spread insecurity. We made it clear that people have nothing to worry about who didn't vote for the People's Progressive Party. In the years we managed Guyana, our whole country made progress, all of our people. You ask people, ordinary people, when were the best economic times in their lives, and they will say in the period when the PPP was in office. More people started owning vehicles, homes, having jobs, having more income, etc. And all of Guyana did move forward. And that's what we want to return to. The propaganda keeps shifting from one time, it's 400 that the PPP ostensibly killed. That propaganda, although you recall that Granger has been now president for 5 years, he never launched a commission of inquiry into that. But he launched about 15 other commissions of inquiry and into everything under the sun. Why did he not do that? Because the commission of inquiry would have concluded, as if you read the report done by Stabroek News, a center spread to show all the people who were killed, you would find that it's not true. that the bandits were on a rampage, and many of them were supported by leaders in the APNU, and they saw it as a political task. So I'm not going to respond to that. The numbers keep growing. It's 1,400. Volder Lawrence said we killed 500,000 people in Region 4 alone. 500,000 is nearly 70% of our total population, but in Region 4 alone, it gets more and more ridiculous, designed to spread insecurity. They're trying to do this with public servants, and the public servants have nothing to worry about. They have been working under the PPP, many of them, people who were hired by APNU. Most of them, except the political appointees, don't have anything to worry about, the senior political appointees. Because they would, some of these senior political appointees, like at the ministerial level, etc., those would have to go on some of these commissions, particularly where there is a blatant theft of resources. And so public servants have nothing to worry about. I want to urge people to desist from spreading conspiracy about our armed forces. The armed forces of Guyana, the Guyana Defense Force, Mr. Granger himself spoke about this in the interview, about when the 1973 events, when he said he was not directly involved, but by implication he was saying other people were involved when the GDF went and took away the ballot boxes and people were killed in that regard. He mentioned that in his interview. He said he wasn't directly involved. And that is the era that we came from. What he was tacitly saying, that the army was involved in politics. In the 20-odd years we were there, we tried to professionalize our armed forces. They work well under the PPP government. The well-being of the armed forces was increased dramatically, from scholarships to training to even the annual bonus for our joint services. They were treated decently, and we intend to do precisely the same once the PPP gets back into office. There will be no recrimination. That is not in our ethos. And so I know that people are just spreading a lot of conspiracy theory now. I expect that the soldiers will act professionally, and there is no reason to tell us now that they will not act professionally. These are career officers. We have fought very hard to professionalize not just the armed forces, but the other branches of the discipline services. So I hope that people will not spread all of these conspiracy theories at this point in time. It plays right into APNU's hands to unsettle our society and to create more ethnic fear by coming out with people will be killed and they will be disenfranchised. If they're Afro-Guyanese, that is to generate ethnic fear. And secondly, to want to create a security fear now. This is part of their playbook, and let's not buy into that and help to propagate it. I see now that they are moving selectively to share their hampers. We already been pushing for more help to people on the ground. We believe the help is minimal now and just a drop in the bucket. People all across the country need a lot of help. I'm alarmed by the pandemic or the pandemic's escalation in some parts of our country, especially in the Moruca sub-district. And that is not just alarming, it's horrific for the people living there. They have not received the type of support that they should receive. By now, that area should be declared an area of an emergency area, hotspot, and all of the government agencies should be working to contain the pandemic there and to bring support to the people. But right across Guyana, people need more support. They continue to need more masks. The government should be giving this out. I want to commend all the NGOs who have been doing this, who have been sharing hampers, etc. The government should be doing this, supporting people directly, and not just a few people, but most people in our country. So I want to urge people to take all the help. It's coming from taxpayers' money, but make sure you keep records, because we've already heard that some of the places that they're sending people to collect goods from that are close, they're cronies of ministers, some ministers, and that a lot of the vouchers and stuff already talking about people will be selectively, and some politically connected people will collect a large number of the vouchers. With them, it's everything is a corrupt act. But people should do that. I want to his credit, Mr. Granger said he had great respect for his Caribbean colleagues, but if he does, how is it that every night he allows people to disparage great Caribbean leaders, and their only fault is because they dare to speak the truth? That is, APNU has lost the elections, and the recount data must be used to declare the victor, which has already been decided by the commission itself. So they're only repeating what the commission had decided already. And so this is, Mr. Granger says he wants a declaration, I saw in his interview, that will be supported by all of Guyana and also the international community. Well, Mr. Granger, you can't be cussing the entire international community, from the OAS, the Commonwealth, CARICOM, the ambassadors from the ABC countries, everyone under the sun, the elders, etc., the whole world, and then expect them and want to use Lowenfield's fraudulent results to declare the elections and expect that the declaration will have the support of the entire international community and the Guyanese public. That is his expectation of the declaration. The only declaration that will result in that, and if you really believe what you said there, that you want to show the world that we can bring this to an orderly conclusion, and you want the result to be accepted by all Guyanese and the international community, then you have to rein in all your people. You should concede. You should insist that Lowenfield follows the lawful instruction of the commission and declare the results. You can't have Nagamutu going around the region whilst you're saying that you respect CARICOM leaders on TV programs around the region, disparaging CARICOM heads, that they're all in bed with the People's Progressive Party and that their CARICOM is lying and all of this sort of stuff. This guy is reprehensible, totally reprehensible. He is, it tells you a lot, some of the reasons why they're behaving this way, and it's a small group of them, why they're behaving this way. They just want to hang on to the perks to the very end. Now take Nagamutu, for example. He should have cleared out of the Prime Minister's residence before the elections. He knew even if APNU won the elections, then he wouldn't have been Prime Minister. And now that the PPP has won the elections, is confirmed by the recount data, and the entire world knows this, even more so. But he hangs in there, continuing to the last few hours to hang on to the perks. And there are many people who have already cleared out their offices. Even Mr. Granger, I heard, has cleared out a lot of stuff from State House, his personal stuff. So many, and Ramjatan admitted, he was taped as admitting they lost the elections. They know it. He is taped as saying the PPP won by over 15,000 votes. But he's hoping to win by, they're hoping to win by a technicality. And the technicality is that we must accept Mingo's fraudulent report, and that the commission, Mingo, who, not Mingo, Lowenfields, but that who hired him must now be subjected to his diktat. That is what they are arguing about. I would urge people to view so there are many things that I agree with Granger on in his statement. There are lots of things that I disagree with for the reason that I outlined. And we have to await the ruling of the CCJ because they have suspended all the processes. But at the end of the day, it's not the courts that decide on the declaration. It is the commission. And the commission has already written to Lowenfield saying he must use the recount data. And Lowenfield has acted fraudulently and in an insubordinate manner and has refused to do so. And therefore, we hope that at the appropriate time, the commission, through its chair, will direct Lowenfield to submit a lawful report showing the valid votes cast as deemed valid by the certificates that his staff signed, and that the declaration would be made on that basis. That, Mr. Granger, would allow our country to move forward, and all the parties can then, with respect, and to avoid the sanctions, because he thinks that sanctions are just idle threat. It's not, they're not so, and they would harm our country. So this is the decent thing to do. This is the decent thing to do. And I don't know if they behave so indecently. How do they want to engage afterwards? They're saying to talk about executive, some form of sharing of power. That's what they're arguing on the sidelines. They keep saying that and sending messages. And then on the other hand, they're acting in this callous, unlawful manner. So I would say just be patient too. Thank you.